Captain Ryan Mitchell pushed through the heavy doors of the Starlight Cantina and immediately regretted every decision that had led him to this moment. The bar was packed with creatures from 100 different worlds, and the air smelled like burning metal and something sweet that made his head spin, and all he wanted was one drink before heading back to his tiny quarters on Station 12. He had been awake for 16 hours straight, repairing a coolant leak on the lower decks, and his hands still shook from the cold and his eyes burned from staring at welding sparks, and he just needed to sit down for 5 minutes. Ryan squeezed through the crowd trying to reach the bar, and that was when it happened. He turned left at the exact wrong moment and his shoulder collided with something solid, and he heard a splash, and then the entire cantina went quiet in that special way that meant someone had just made a terrible mistake. Ryan looked up and saw her. She was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, with silver hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes that glowed like molten gold. And she wore dark leather armor that looked ancient and expensive, and right now it was covered in purple liquid that dripped onto the floor. Behind her stood 2 massive dragons. Ryan had seen pictures of dragons in old Earth books, but those had been fantasy, and these were real, and they were huge, with scales that shifted between deep blue and emerald green depending on how the light hit them, and their eyes were fixed on him with the kind of attention that made his survival instincts scream. The elf woman wiped purple liquid from her face and said something in a musical language that Ryan did not understand, but the tone was clear enough. She was not happy. Ryan held up both hands, trying to look as harmless as possible, and started apologizing, but his voice came out as a squeak because one of the dragons had just taken a step closer and he could feel the heat radiating from its body. The woman held up one hand and the dragons stopped moving, but they kept staring at Ryan like they were deciding which part of him would taste best. She switched to English, and her accent was strange, like wind moving through leaves, and she told him that he had insulted her honor and spilled her drink, which she had waited 20 minutes to get, and now there was only one way to settle this. Ryan asked what that was, even though he already knew the answer: a duel. The crowd around them started cheering, and Ryan wanted to explain that it was an accident, that he was tired and clumsy, and really did not want to fight anyone, especially not someone with 2 dragons. But the elf woman was already moving. She pulled a sword from her back, and it looked like it had been carved from solid starlight, and Ryan looked down at his standard-issue plasma pistol and thought about how his mother had warned him about taking jobs in deep space. The woman introduced herself as Kira of House Arenthal and said that where she came from, honor was everything, and even accidents required proper resolution. Ryan told her his name and tried one more time to apologize, but someone in the crowd threw him a practice sword, and Kira smiled in a way that made him think maybe she was enjoying this more than she should. The bartender cleared tables from the center of the room, and people started placing bets, and Ryan heard someone offer 3-to-1 odds against him surviving, and he wondered if it was too late to just run away. Kira took a fighting stance that looked impossibly graceful and told him that if he could land even one strike, she would consider her honor satisfied, and they could part as equals. Ryan had military training from his time in the Earth Defense Corps, and he had been in plenty of fights, but none of them had been against magical elf women with ancient swords and pet dragons. He raised the practice blade and tried to remember everything his combat instructor had taught him, and Kira nodded with approval and said he held the weapon well for a human. Then she moved. Ryan barely saw it coming, and suddenly his sword was flying across the room and his arm was numb, and Kira was standing exactly where she had started, with her blade pointed at his chest. The crowd laughed, but not in a cruel way. More like they were watching a favorite entertainment, and someone yelled that he should try harder. Kira tossed his sword back to him and gestured for him to come at her again, and Ryan caught the blade and decided that if he was going to lose, he might as well make it interesting. He attacked with everything he had, using every trick and technique he knew, and for about 3 seconds he thought he might actually have a chance. Then Kira disarmed him again, and this time she moved so fast that he did not even see her blade until it was pressed against his throat, and the dragons rumbled with what sounded like approval. Ryan admitted defeat and waited for whatever came next, but instead of humiliation or anger, Kira lowered her sword and offered him her hand. She pulled him to his feet with surprising strength and told him that he fought with honor, even though he had no skill against her. And that was worth respecting. The crowd cheered and people clapped Ryan on the back like he had won instead of lost, and Kira sheathed her sword and told the bartender to bring 2 drinks on her coin. Ryan stood there breathing hard and trying to process what had just happened while the 2 dragons settled on either side of Kira and watched him with eyes that seemed far too intelligent. Kira handed him a drink and said that any human brave enough to face her, after seeing Ember and Frost, deserved at least a conversation. Ryan took the drink and realized that maybe getting into a duel was not the worst thing that could have happened tonight after all. Ryan sat down at a corner table with Kira, while Ember and Frost positioned themselves like living shields around them, and he realized that everyone else in the cantina was giving them a wide circle of space. The purple drink Kira had ordered tasted like starfruit mixed with something electric, and it made his tongue tingle, but in a pleasant way. And after the 3rd sip, he felt the exhaustion from his long shift starting to fade. Kira watched him with those golden eyes and asked how long he had been in space, and Ryan told her 3 years since leaving Earth and taking contract work wherever he could find it. She nodded and said she could tell by the way he moved that he was used to gravity shifts and long hours in cramped ships, and Ryan asked how she could possibly know that. Kira smiled and said that elves were trained to read people the same way humans read books, and that he carried himself like someone who had been running for a long time but did not know what he was running. Ryan felt exposed by that observation, but he could not argue with it because it was true. He changed the subject and asked about the dragons, and Kira's face softened in a way that made her look younger, and she reached out to scratch Ember behind his massive horns. She explained that on her homeworld of Arenthal, every elf was bonded with dragons from birth, and that Ember and Frost had hatched in her hands when she was only 5 years old, and they had been together ever since. Ryan asked what that meant exactly, and Kira said it meant they shared thoughts and feelings and could communicate without words, and that she could feel their hearts beating in rhythm with her own Frost. The dragon with more blue in her scales made a rumbling sound and pushed her enormous head against Ryan's leg, and he froze, not sure if this was affection or a threat. Kira laughed and said that Frost liked him, which was unusual because dragons were normally suspicious of humans and only trusted those they considered worthy. Ryan carefully placed his hand on Frost's head, and her scales felt warm and smooth like polished stone. And she rumbled again, and he realized she was purring. Ember watched this with interest, and then decided that if his sister was getting attention, he should too. And suddenly Ryan had 2 massive dragons competing for his affection, and Kira was laughing so hard she nearly spilled her drink. The bartender brought them food, and Ryan discovered that Kira had ordered something called starbread, which glowed faintly and tasted like honey and cinnamon, and she told him it was made from grain that only grew under triple moonlight. They talked for hours, and Ryan found himself telling her things he had not shared with anyone in years about growing up in New York and watching the sky and dreaming of stars, and how he had joined the military to get off Earth, but found that space was lonelier than he expected. Kira listened without judgment and told him about Arenthal, about forests where the trees sang in the wind, and cities built into mountains, and rivers that flowed with water so pure it could heal wounds. She said she had left her homeworld because it had become too safe, too predictable, and she wanted to see the galaxy and test herself against challenges that her ancestors never faced. Ryan asked if she missed it, and Kira was quiet for a moment before saying yes, but not enough to go back because some people were meant to wander, and she had accepted that about herself a long time ago. The cantina started to empty as the station's artificial night cycle approached, and Kira stretched and said she should probably return to her ship before the docking fees increased. Ryan helped her gather her things, and Ember and Frost stood and shook themselves like enormous cats, and their scales made a sound like wind chimes. Kira paused at the door and looked back at Ryan with an expression he could not quite read, and then she asked if he would walk her back to her ship. Ryan was surprised because she had 2 dragons and clearly did not need protection from anything, but she explained that the station had some rough sectors, and besides, she had enjoyed their conversation and did not want it to end just yet. Ryan agreed immediately. They left the cantina and stepped into the dimly lit corridors of Station 12, and the walls were metal and cold and covered in graffiti from 1,000 different languages and cultures. Ember and Frost walked behind them, and their claws clicked on the floor with a rhythm that echoed off the walls and made Ryan think of ancient drums. Kira told him more stories as they walked about worlds she had visited and battles she had fought, and creatures she had met, and Ryan realized that her life was the kind of adventure he had always dreamed about but never quite achieved. He told her about his work repairing ships and maintaining systems and how it was honest work, but sometimes felt small compared to the vastness of space around him. Kira stopped walking and turned to face him and said that there was no such thing as small work, because every ship he repaired carried people who had dreams and destinations, and without people like him, the galaxy would grind to a halt. Ryan had never thought about it that way, and he felt something shift in his chest, like a weight he did not know he was carrying had suddenly gotten lighter. They reached the docking bay where Kira's ship was berthed, and it was sleek and silver with designs etched into the hull that looked like flowing water, and Ryan could tell just by looking that it was worth more than everything he owned. Combined, Kira thanked him for walking with her and for being a good sport about the Duel, and Ember and Frost both made approving sounds that vibrated through the deck plates. Ryan was about to say goodnight when Kira asked if he had any plans for the next few days, because her navigation system had been acting strange and she had heard from the bartender that he was good with repairs. Ryan said he could take a look, and Kira smiled that playful smile again and told him to come by in the morning and bring tools. As Ryan walked back to his quarters, he realized that getting challenged to a duel over spilled drinks might have been the best accident of his life. Ryan showed up at Kira's ship early the next morning with his toolkit and a thermos of coffee that he had replicated from the station dispenser, and it tasted like burnt plastic, but it was better than nothing. The ship's boarding ramp was already lowered, and he could hear Kira's voice from inside speaking in that musical language to her dragons, and they responded with rumbling sounds that made the hull vibrate. Ryan climbed the ramp and stepped into an interior that took his breath away, because every surface was covered in intricate carvings and the walls glowed with soft blue light. And he realized this was not just a ship. It was a work of art. Kira appeared from the cockpit wearing simpler clothes than the night before, just a loose tunic and pants, but she still moved with that same impossible grace, and Ember and Frost were right behind her looking alert and curious. She greeted Ryan warmly and offered him tea from a pot that looked ancient, and he accepted even though he had no idea what he was drinking and it tasted like flowers and lightning. Kira led him to the navigation console and explained that the system kept showing phantom readings, like there were stars where none existed, and sometimes the coordinates would shift by themselves, and she was worried it might be a serious malfunction. Ryan set down his tools and started running diagnostics, and Kira sat nearby watching him work and asking questions about what he was doing and why. He explained the basic principles of stellar navigation and how the systems used quantum positioning to triangulate location across vast distances, and Kira listened with genuine interest and made connections to magical navigation techniques from her world. Ryan discovered that the problem was not a malfunction, but interference from a rare mineral in the ship's hull that Aerenthal craftsmen had used for structural integrity. But human technology was not designed to account for it. He made adjustments to the calibration settings and added filters to screen out the interference, and within an hour the navigation system was running perfectly, and Kira looked impressed. She said that mechanics on 3 different stations had told her the ship needed expensive replacements, but Ryan had fixed it with simple adjustments, and that showed real understanding of how things worked. Ryan felt pride warm his chest and said that sometimes the best solutions were the simplest ones, and Kira agreed and said that was wisdom her people had known for centuries. Ember wandered over and inspected Ryan's tools with interest and accidentally knocked a wrench off the console with his tail, and Ryan caught it before it hit the ground, and both dragons made sounds that he was starting to recognize as approval. Kira invited him to stay for lunch, and he accepted, and she prepared food from her home world, including some kind of meat that tasted like spiced chicken and vegetables that changed color when cooked, and bread that was still warm from the oven. They ate in the ship's common area, which had cushions instead of chairs and windows that showed the stars outside, and Ryan felt more relaxed than he had in months. Kira asked about his family, and Ryan told her about his parents who still lived in New York and worried about him constantly, and his sister who had become a teacher and never understood why he needed to leave Earth. He asked about her family, and Kira's expression became distant, and she said that her parents had died when she was young in a conflict between dragon houses, and that Ember and Frost were the only family she had left. Ryan said he was sorry, and Kira shook her head and said it was long ago, and she had made peace with it. and that loss had taught her to value the bonds she did have. Frost rested her massive head in Kira's lap, and the elf woman stroked her scales gently, and Ryan saw the deep connection between them, and understood why she had said they were family. After lunch, Kira showed him more of the ship, including her personal quarters, which had a hammock instead of a bed, and walls covered in maps of places she had been, and weapons from different worlds mounted like trophies. She had a collection of books that looked ancient and fragile, and Ryan asked if he could look at them. And Kira seemed pleased by his interest and handed him one carefully. The book was written in her language, but the illustrations showed dragons and elves in various scenes of daily life. And Kira explained each image and told him stories about her culture and history. Ryan learned that elves lived for hundreds of years, and that Kira was actually 72, though she looked no older than 30 by human standards, and that dragons lived even longer, sometimes for 1,000 years or more. He asked if that made relationships with shorter-lived species difficult, and Kira was quiet for a moment before saying yes. But it also made them precious because every moment mattered more when you knew time was limited. Ryan felt something shift in the air between them, and Kira looked away first, and suggested they go to the observation deck where the view was better. The observation deck was a dome of transparent material that showed the stars in every direction, and Ryan had been in space for years, but this view still made him feel small and insignificant. In the best possible way, Kira pointed out constellations from her world that were not visible from Earth and told him stories about the heroes and monsters that the patterns represented. Ryan showed her Earth constellations and told the Greek myths behind them. And Kira laughed at how similar stories were across the galaxy, even when the species telling them were completely different. They stood there for a long time just watching the stars and talking, and Ryan realized he had never felt this comfortable with anyone before. And it scared him a little because Kira would live for centuries and he would be lucky to make it to 80 A's. If reading his thoughts, Kira said that her people had a saying about time and connection, and she translated it as the brightest flames burn fastest, but their light travels farthest. Ryan understood what she meant, and he decided that whatever this was between them, it was worth pursuing even if it could not last forever. Kira asked if he had evening plans, and Ryan admitted he had nothing except another shift tomorrow, and Kira suggested he stay for dinner, and maybe watch the meteor shower that was supposed to pass by the station tonight. Ryan agreed and sent a message to his supervisor requesting personal time, and for the first time in 3 years he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The meteor shower started just after dinner, and Ryan and Kira sat in the observation dome with Ember and Frost curled around them like living blankets, and watched streaks of light paint the darkness. Kira had dimmed the ship's interior lights so the stars were brighter, and she had brought blankets that smelled like cedar, and something sweet he could not identify, and the whole scene felt dreamlike. Ryan asked how long she planned to stay at Station 12, and Kira said she had not decided, yet because she had no schedule and no destination in mind, and that was the freedom she had been searching for when she left Arenthal. He said that sounded lonely, and she admitted it was sometimes, but loneliness was different from being alone, and she had learned to appreciate the distinction. Ryan understood that because he had been surrounded by people on Earth, but felt isolated in ways he could not explain until he left, and found that physical distance sometimes brought emotional clarity. A particularly bright meteor streaked across the sky, and Kira pointed out that it was probably iron-rich based on the color, and Ryan was impressed that she knew that, and she explained that dragon riders learned to read the sky because their lives often depended on it. Ember raised his head and made a sound that was almost like singing, and Frost joined in, and suddenly the observation dome was filled with harmonics that made Ryan's bones vibrate, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. Kira smiled and said the dragons were greeting the meteor shower in the traditional way, and that every dragon had a unique song, and she had heard theirs so many times she could recognize them across miles. Ryan asked if she could sing too, and Kira laughed and said her voice was not nearly as impressive, but she hummed along with her dragons, and the combination created music that seemed to come from another world entirely. When the song ended, Ryan realized he had tears in his eyes, and he quickly wiped them away, but Kira had seen, and she did not comment, just reached over and squeezed his hand gently. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Kira asked what Ryan wanted from life, and he was surprised by the directness of the question, He thought about it and said he used to want adventure and excitement, but lately he had been wondering if what he really wanted was connection and purpose, and maybe those things were more valuable than adrenaline. Kira nodded and said that was wisdom, and it usually took people much longer to learn it, and Ryan asked how long it had taken her. She said about 40 years, and they both laughed, and Ryan felt the age difference between them, but it did not seem to matter, because they understood each other in ways that had nothing to do with time. Kira told him about a planet she had visited where the inhabitants lived for only 10 years, but they packed more joy and meaning into that decade than most species managed in centuries, and it had taught her that length of life mattered less than depth of experience. Ryan said he wanted to visit places like that, and Kira suggested he could, and he explained that his contract work kept him tied to stations and repair schedules, and he could not just leave whenever he wanted. Kira asked why not, and Ryan realized he did not have a good answer, except that it was what he had always done, and change felt scary. Even when staying felt wrong, she said that fear was normal, but it should not be a cage, and sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was walk away from security toward uncertainty. Ryan knew she was right, but he did not know how to take that first step, and Kira seemed to sense his hesitation because she changed the subject and asked if he wanted to meet her other crew member. Ryan was confused because he thought it was just Kira and the dragons, and she laughed and led him down to the cargo hold where a small robot was organizing supplies. The robot was about 3 feet tall with multiple arms and a screen for a face, and when it saw them, it displayed a smiley face and waved enthusiastically. Kira introduced the robot as Chip and explained that she had found him deactivated on an abandoned station and repaired him, and he had been with her ever since, helping with tasks that required precision or access to small spaces. Chip displayed text on his screen saying hello, and that he was pleased to meet any friend of Kira's, and Ryan was charmed by the little robot's personality. Kira said that Chip had become surprisingly good at predicting when the ship needed maintenance, and had probably saved her life a dozen times by catching problems before they became critical. Ryan examined Chip with professional interest and saw that his construction was a mix of technologies from different species, and that someone had put a lot of care into his repair and upgrades. He complimented Kira on her work, and she admitted that she had always been good with machines, which was unusual for elves since most of her people preferred magic to technology. Ryan said that maybe that was what made her special, and Kira looked at him with an expression he could not quite read, and then she kissed him. It was gentle and brief, and when she pulled back, she looked uncertain, like she had surprised herself as much as him. Ryan did not hesitate and kissed her back, and this time it lasted longer, and when they finally separated, both dragons were watching them with what looked like approval. Kira laughed and said that Ember and Frost had been pushing her toward this since yesterday, and apparently dragons were not subtle about matchmaking. Ryan said he was glad they had interfered, and Kira agreed. And they stood there in the cargo hold with Chip displaying hearts on his screen, and both of them smiling like teenagers. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversation and laughter and more kissing, and Ryan felt like he was living in a story instead of real life. When it was late, Kira offered to let him stay in the guest quarters, and Ryan accepted, and she showed him to a small cabin that was more comfortable than his entire apartment on the station. Before she left, she said that tomorrow she was planning to take the ship out for a test flight to make sure the navigation repairs held, and asked if he wanted to come. Ryan said yes without hesitation, and Kira smiled and told him to get some rest, because flying with dragons was not for the faint of heart. After she left, Ryan lay in the guest bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about how his life had completely changed in less than 24 hours. He had gone from lonely and directionless to connected and excited about the future, and all because he had accidentally bumped into someone in a bar. Ryan smiled and closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he slept without dreaming of empty spaces. Ryan woke to the sound of dragons moving through the ship and the smell of something delicious cooking. And for a moment he forgot where he was until memory caught up with him, and he smiled. He dressed quickly and found Kira in the galley preparing breakfast, and Ember and Frost were watching her with the focus of creatures who knew food was coming. Soon Kira greeted him warmly and handed him a plate of eggs and bread and fruit he did not recognize, and they ate together while she explained the flight plan for the day. She wanted to take the ship out past the station's traffic lanes and into open space. where she could test the navigation at higher speeds and make sure everything was working correctly. Ryan asked if there was anything he should know about flying on an elf ship, and Kira grinned and said just to hold on tight because she liked going fast. After breakfast, they went through pre-flight checks together, and Ryan was impressed by how well-maintained everything was and how Kira had integrated technology from different species into a cohesive system chip, helped with the preparations, displaying helpful reminders and making sure nothing was forgotten, and Ryan could see why Kira valued the little robot so highly. When everything was ready, Kira took her place in the pilot seat and Ryan strapped into the co-pilot position, and Ember and Frost settled in the back in specially designed harnesses that accommodated their size. Kira requested departure clearance from Station Control, and they got immediate approval, and she guided the ship smoothly out of the docking bay and into open space. For a few minutes, she flew at standard speeds, running through system checks and verifying that everything responded correctly, and then she looked at Ryan with that playful smile and asked if he was ready. Before he could answer, she pushed the throttle forward and the ship leaped ahead like a living thing, and Ryan was pressed back into his seat, and the stars stretched into lines. Kira laughed with pure joy and the dragons roared, and Ryan found himself laughing too, because this was incredible and terrifying, and exactly what he needed. She performed maneuvers that should not have been possible, banking and rolling, and diving through space like they were flying through atmosphere, and the ship responded to her commands with perfect precision. Ryan watched her fly and understood that this was what she had been born to do, and that staying in one place would have killed something essential in her spirit. After an hour of testing, Kira was satisfied that the navigation system was working perfectly, and she thanked Ryan for his repair work and said that he had probably saved her from a much more expensive fix. Ryan said it was his pleasure and meant it, and Kira suggested they explore a nearby nebula before heading back since they were already out here. The nebula was a cloud of blue and purple gas that glowed with inner light, and Kira flew them into it slowly, and the colors swirled around the ship like living things. She explained that nebulas like this were nurseries where new stars were born, and that dragon riders considered them sacred places because they represented possibility and transformation. Ryan understood why, because being inside the nebula felt like being inside a dream, and he could see why ancient cultures would have built religions around experiences like this. Ember and Frost became unusually quiet and still, and Kira said they were meditating in the dragon way, which involved absorbing energy from their surroundings and becoming part of the greater whole. They stayed in the nebula for almost an hour, and Ryan felt something shift inside him, like a decision crystallizing without conscious thought. When they emerged back into normal space, he told Kira that he wanted to quit his contract work and travel, and see the galaxy the way she did. Kira was quiet for a moment, and then she asked if he was sure, because that was a big decision and he should not make it based on one magical day. Ryan said he had been thinking about it for months, and meeting her had just given him the courage to admit what he really wanted, and he was more sure about this than he had been about anything in years. Kira asked what he planned to do, and Ryan admitted he had no specific plan, but he had savings and skills, and he trusted that opportunities would present themselves. She smiled and said that was very human to jump into uncertainty, with nothing but hope and determination, and it was one of the things she admired most about his species. Then she asked if he would be interested in joining her crew, at least temporarily, because she could use someone with technical skills. And Chip could use a friend who understood robotics. Ryan felt his heart jump, and he asked if she was serious, and Kira said completely serious, and that having him around would make the journey more interesting. He accepted immediately, and they shook hands, formally, and then laughed because formal felt wrong after everything they had shared. On the flight back to the station, they made plans, and Ryan would need to give proper notice to his supervisor and pack his belongings and close out his apartment contract, but none of that seemed difficult anymore. Kira said they would wait at Station 12 for as long as necessary, and that she was in no hurry. And besides, the station had good food and interesting people. When they docked, Ryan went straight to his supervisor's office and submitted his resignation effective in 2 weeks, and his supervisor was surprised but not angry, and wished him luck with whatever came next. Ryan spent the next 2 weeks working his final shifts and spending every free moment on Kira's ship, helping her plan their route and learning how to operate elf technology. Ember and Frost seemed to accept him as part of their family and would sometimes curl up around him when he was working, and he learned that dragon body heat was incredibly comforting. On his last day of contract work, his co-workers threw him a small party at the cantina where he had first met Kira, and they told stories and wished him well, and several people said they envied his courage. Ryan realized that he had been more connected to these people than he thought, and leaving was harder than expected, but he knew he was making the right choice. That evening, he moved his belongings onto Kira's ship, and Chip helped him organize everything. In his new quarters, which were bigger than his old apartment and had a window showing the stars, Kira came to check on him and found him staring out that window with the expression of wonder, and she said that look never got old, no matter how long you spent in space. Ryan turned to her and said thank you for challenging him to that duel because it had changed his life. And Kira laughed and said thank you for being clumsy enough to spill her drink. They left Station 12 the next morning, heading toward a cluster of unexplored systems that Kira had heard rumors about, and Ryan stood on the observation deck watching the station shrink behind them. He thought about his old life and his old fears, and realized that sometimes the best thing that could happen to a person was having their comfortable routine completely destroyed by accident. Ember and Frost sang their traveling song, and Kira joined in, and Ryan hummed along even though he did not know the melody, and together they flew toward whatever adventures awaited them in the vast and beautiful darkness between the stars.